Lonely Cowboy. Found a Cherokee girl tied to his horse with a note. Don't untie her before sunset. The wind howled like a hungry wolf that morning, sweeping through the Colorado pines with a sharpness that bit into the bones. Snow had fallen the night before thick, heavy drifts that dulled every sound and blanketed the mountains in a cruel kind of peace. Thaddeus Thorne stood on the porch of his weather-worn cabin, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand, eyes narrowed at the tree line. 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered. His frame bore the quiet authority of a man who'd lived through war and barely lived past it. His face, half-shadowed beneath the brim of a battered Stetson, held lines deeper than any man his age should have had etched by memories he couldn't quite recall, and silence he couldn't quite escape. Then he saw it. His chestnut mare, Lark, was returning alone, or so he thought until the shape on her back shifted. There, slumped and trussed like a sack of grain, was a girl. If your heart skips a beat for cowboy love stories filled with danger, secrets, and redemption, drop a and comment number 1 below. Let's ride this tale together on Wild West Love. She was no older than 20, maybe younger. Her skin was warm copper beneath the smears of mud and snow, cheekbones sharp like they were carved by wind, her long black hair tangled but still braided in the Cherokee way beads, and sinew glinting faintly like sorrow in sunlight. Around her neck, hung on a thin piece of deer hide, was a wooden sign, "Don't untie her before sunset." The letters were burned in, uneven, desperate. Thad's breath froze in his throat. What in God's name? He reached for the girl, feeling the tremble in her shoulders, part cold, part defiance. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, burning, unreadable. "You alive?" he asked gruffly. No answer. "You speak English?" Still nothing. He took the reins, guiding Lark into the shed beside the cabin. He didn't dare cut the rope's knot yet. Something about that sign chilled him more than the wind. Inside the cabin, warmth from the firestones pushed back the mountain cold. Thad eased her down onto the bearskin rug, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. Her body was light, too light-like. She'd been starved for days. Her wrists, bound behind her back with rawhide cord, were red and bruised. "Jesus," he muttered. "What the hell happened to you?" Still, she said nothing, just stared at him like she was measuring his soul. "Suit yourself," he grumbled, setting a pot of beans on the hearth. "Sunday sets at 5:15. You got 4 hours. Lay." He tried not to look at her too long. But damn if it wasn't hard. There was something wild in her, something unbroken, even tied like she was. Like a mountain cat caught in a snare that still refused to blink. He respected that, maybe even envied it. Hours passed. He fed her broth, careful not to spill as he brought the tin cup to her lips. She drank, eyes never leaving his face. When the stew finished, he chewed his own in silence. "Name's Thad," he said finally. "Thaddeus Thorne. Used to ride with the 6th Cavalry. Been up here, I don't know, 3 winters now." "Nothing." "You got a name?" Her mouth twitched, half a sneer, half a wince. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he added more softly. "And I sure as hell ain't gonna hand you back to whoever strung you up like that." Still nothing. Her gaze drifted to the window toward the light, turning orange behind the pines. At exactly 5:15, with the sun bleeding into the Rockies like an open wound, Thad pulled out his hunting knife. The steel glinted briefly. "Here goes," he said, crouching beside her. "Let's hope this ain't some kind of curse." The knife slipped under the rawhide. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Snap. Her arms fell free. Immediately, she rolled away from him, stumbling onto all fours like she was ready to ruin her fight. Thad raised both palms. "Easy. I ain't your enemy." "Vet." She stared again. This time, something shifted in her eyes. Not softness, but recognition. A flicker of something long buried. "My name," she said hoarsely, "is Luna." The first word she'd spoken. Her voice was like a dry wind off sandstone low, rough, proud. Luna sat by the fire, her hands shaking slightly as she took the metal cup. "You should have left me there." "Maybe," Thad said, sitting opposite her. "But I didn't. You don't know what I've done." He shook his head. "Don't care." She laughed, but it came out broken. They think I betrayed the tribe. Think I sold them out to white men for coin. And did you? Her jaw clenched. Her gaze dropped. But I was going to share something. Something sacred. Something that could have helped us all. But they called it betrayal. Thad leaned back, watching the shadows play on the log walls. His mind drifted to screams, to fire, to the smell of gunpowder and blood. There was a girl, he said, back at Rio Diablo. I was supposed to protect her. During a parley, things went bad. I got hit, don't remember much after that. She vanished, maybe died, maybe not. Luna looked up slowly. Was she Cherokee? He nodded. Her hands curled into fists. They always say we disappear, but the truth is, you never come back. Silence fell between them, heavy, bitter. Maybe I didn't come back, he murmured. But I never forgot. She studied him. For the first time, the anger in her gaze dimmed. Then why are you here? Thad ran a hand through his dark, unwashed hair. Looking for peace, for silence, for punishment. Luna stared into the flames. Then maybe we're the same. The wind howled again. Outside, the snow began to fall once more, covering old tracks. Inside that tiny cabin, in the shadow of the mountains, two souls sat wounded, wary, but no longer alone. She broke the silence first. There's a place, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Up past Ghost Elk Ridge, a spring. They say it can heal anything, wounds, sickness, even madness. Thad's brows lifted. You believe in that? She looked him straight in the eye. I have to. The night wrapped around the cabin like a thick wool blanket, heavy, dark, and humming with silence. The fire had dwindled to coals, glowing like old secrets, casting faint red halos across the uneven floorboards. Thad sat in the corner, back against the log wall, long legs stretched out. One boot crossed over the other. Luna lay curled on the bearskin rug, arms tucked close to her chest, breathing slow but shallow. She hadn't said another word about the spring, and he hadn't pushed her. He knew the shape of silence too well to trespass into hers too quickly. Outside, the cold was sharpening again. The wind scraped through the narrow valley like a knife against bone. Trees cracked in the distance, branches surrendering under the weight of fresh snow. It was the kind of night where the past slithered back into your head, uninvited and unforgiving. Thad closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. It rarely did anymore. And tonight, something about the girl, about Luna, kept his nerves taut like a rifle string. He could still see the way she'd looked at him earlier. Not with fear, not even hate, but with judgment, like she'd seen the hollowness in him and recognized it. Like maybe she had the same void clawing at her from the inside out. At some point in the dead hours, he drifted into a shallow doze, only to jolt awake at the creak of floorboards. His hand went instinctively to the revolver beneath his coat, but paused when he saw her silhouette near the hearth. Luna knelt in front of the ashes, coaxing a faint flame from the coals, with the careful tenderness of someone who knew how to bring fire back from near death. She moved slow, almost reverently, like she wasn't just warming the room, but calling something ancient to life. Thad watched, saying nothing. Eventually, she spoke without turning. You ever seen someone flayed alive? The question came out flat, not trembling, not emotional, just bare. He swallowed. Number came close, maybe, but I never saw it. She nodded, like she hadn't expected him to. I did, she said. I was 10. He didn't ask, just waited. They tied him to a mesquite tree near Red Hollow, she continued. Said he broke sacred law. But he didn't. He just shared a story about the spring. Apache. Same spring you asked me about. Thad sat up slowly, boots scuffing against the floor. That man, he was family? She shook her head. Worse, he was my teacher, the last real healer in our bloodline. The fire snapped, a single ember leaping into the air before vanishing. I watched them peel the knowledge from his body like they could unlearn it, she whispered. And then they told me to never speak of it again. Said I was too young to understand the cost of secrets. Her voice cracked barely. So I waited. She finally turned to face him. The flickering light revealed the lines around her mouth, too sharp for someone her age. Her eyes were dry, but raw. Stripped, I waited until I was old enough, strong enough. Then I went back to the place he showed me up near the obsidian cliff, where the water runs warm, even in winter. I took notes, marked trees, made maps. Thad watched her hands thin, calloused, twitching slightly as she spoke. I was going to tell the tribal council, show them, use it to help those who were dying from the white man's sickness, but someone followed me. Her voice dropped to a gravel whisper. They said I betrayed us, that I gave the map to soldiers, that I sold it. Lo. Her gaze lifted, drilling into him now. They beat me, branded me, said I had no blood left, tied me to a horse and sent me into the cold. Thad's stomach twisted, bile rising uninvited. And yet, he asked softly, did I what? Give it to soldiers? She blinked slowly, then scoffed. I gave it to children. I buried copies under pine trees, in leather pouches. I never trusted the old men. I trusted time. Maybe one day someone would find it. Maybe they'd use it to heal instead of hoard. The silence after that was long, sacred. When Thad finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I don't remember much about the war, about what we did out there. But I remember fire, screams, and once, I think, I saw a spring like the one you're talking about. It was hidden in a gulch so deep the light barely touched it. There was steam rising from the rocks even though the snow was waist deep. Men swore it healed faster than anything they'd seen. There. Luna's eyes lit up for a breath then dimmed again. That's it. You think it's still there? I know it is. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Then let's go. Her brows furrowed. Just like that? You need someone to carry supplies. You're half-starved, half-frozen, and probably hunted. You need a gun hand, and maybe. He paused. Maybe I need something worth bleeding for again. She hesitated, then nodded once. But as she reached for her coat, her tunic slipped slightly, revealing the full mark on her left shoulder. A brutal, angry, scar shaped like a burned-out sun. Thad stood slowly. Who did that to you? Her lips tightened. Nyack. The one who once called me sister. Something inside Thad cracked. He didn't show it. Just walked to the window, peering out into the trees, where darkness swirled like smoke. If we're going, he said, voice low, we start at first light. Line. By morning, the world had turned white again. 6 inches of fresh snow coated the ridges, the path barely visible. Thad packed jerky, bullets, 2 flasks of whiskey, and a battered compass that hadn't pointed true in years but still felt necessary. Luna moved with quiet efficiency, every motion economic. She wore a coat too big for her, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her features, and a blade hidden in the folds of her boot. As they saddled the horses, she caught him staring. You think I can't handle this? I think you've handled worse than this, he said honestly, but I ain't about to let you walk into it alone. She looked at him for a long time. Then, without a word, she mounted. They rode through snow-slick ravines and silent forests, the world around them muffled, like even nature held its breath. The route she chose wound north toward Ghost Elk Ridge, where the air got thinner, the trees fewer, and the sky wider than any man could hold in his chest. They stopped to camp near an abandoned mining shack by dusk. While Thad built a fire, Luna pulled a small leather bundle from her satchel. Inside were hand-drawn maps, symbols scrawled in red ochre, lines that curved like rivers but meant something deeper. These, she explained, are the waystones, places of power. You don't just walk to the spring, you earn it. He studied the symbols, frowning. You mean it's spiritual? It's survival. This land chooses who finds its heart. No. He glanced at her. And it chose you? She didn't answer, but the way she folded the maps with care, reverence, and an ache that didn't speak told him everything. Later that night, she sat sharpening her knife under the starlight. Thad poured a capful of whiskey, then offered it. She took it. Their fingers brushed, brief and electric. He cleared his throat. You ever wonder what you'd be if you weren't this? Her eyes lifted to the sky. A falcon, she said without hesitation. Sharp-eyed, always flying but never running. He smiled. I'd be a horse. She snorted. Stubborn, heavy, loyal to a fault? He laughed, deep and quiet. Yeah, that. For a moment, their smiles lingered. Then the sound of a twig snapping shattered it. Both froze. She was up first, blade drawn, eyes scanning the dark. Thad followed, cocking his rifle. Movement in the trees. Just a flicker. But it was enough. "They found us," she whispered. His voice was steel. "Then let's not make it easy." The night had grown cruel. Not just cold cruel, like the mountains had turned their faces away from the two travelers and left them alone with their demons and the distant scent of blood. The fire sputtered low behind them, casting trembling shadows across the rock walls and the brittle snow. The stars above blinked, sharp and unfeeling, like glass beads sewn into a sky that did not care if they lived or died. Thad crouched behind a low outcrop, one knee pressed into the icy earth, his breath fogging the air in pale clouds. His Winchester was cocked and steady, the stock pressed firm against his shoulder, barrel resting along a branch barely thick enough to hold its weight. Beside him, Luna stood unnaturally still. No twitch, no tremble, no visible breath. She was like stone shaped into a woman's form, raw, scarred, silent. One hand rested on the hilt of her blade, fingers coiled loosely. The other tucked into the folds of her coat, near the pouch where she kept the map. "Three of them," she murmured, voice like a ghost dragged over gravel. Thad's eyes didn't leave the tree line. "You sure? They move like wolves." He gave a tight nod. Then movement. A flicker between the trees. Not wind, not animal. Human. Boots breaking snow. Muffled curses in Spanish. A low whistle, the kind meant to signal, not to entertain. "Bounty men?" Thad asked. Luna's jaw clenched. "Number worse. That whistle, it's Nyack." She didn't speak the name so much as spit it, and the bitterness in her voice wrapped around Thad like barbed wire, squeezing breath and memory from his lungs. He had never met Nyack, but he'd met men like him, those who carried hatred like a badge, who fed on loyalty until it bled into cruelty. And now he was here, in the dark, in the trees, hunting them. "Go," Thad said low. "Head east toward the creek. I'll hold 'em off." "Number," her voice cracked like flint. "We stay together. You said yourself this land chooses. That spring don't want my kind. It wants yours. That spring wants the truth," she whispered fiercely. "And right now you're the only damn soul who hasn't tried to break me to get it." He looked at her, then really looked. Her cheeks were flushed raw from wind, but her eyes were unshaken. She was fire in the snow, all sinew and spirit. There was no room in her for cowardice or compromise. Only forward, only flame. And he realized, painfully, that he didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to deserve her trust. A rifle cracked in the distance. The bark near Luna's head exploded, sending splinters into her braid. They dropped, rolled. She landed on her stomach in the snow, blade out, breath shallow. Thad returned Fury a clean shot that echoed through the trees like a thunderclap and was rewarded with a cry. Distant, wet. "One down," he muttered. "Two to go," Luna growled. The next few minutes blurred. They ran shoulders, brushing, boots slamming against ice-crusted earth. The wind howling through pines like the land itself was warning them to turn back. A bullet whined past Thad's ear. They ducked behind a rotting log. Luna's breath came hard now, chest rising and falling beneath the thick folds of her coat, her braid trailing behind her like a whisper from the past. Thad reached for another shell, fingers numbed, loading by instinct. Then footsteps. Too close. Thad turned to fire, but the figure was already there. A man, broad-shouldered, black war paint, smeared across his cheekbones, eyes cold and certain. His rifle raised, too slow. Thad braced himself. But Luna was faster. She moved a blur of motion and muscle and fury. Her knife sliced a clean arc through the night, catching the man under the ribs. He gasped, dropped the rifle, stumbled back, but not before he lashed out with a short hatchet that caught Luna square across the shoulder. She hit the snow like stone dropped in water. "Luna!" Thad surged forward, tackled the man, fists slamming again and again until the only sound left was his own breath and the soft rattle of death. He turned to her. She was bleeding. Not a nick. A wound. Deep. Ripped. Red blooming through her coat like a poppy in winter. "Don't you dare," he hissed, tearing the fabric open, pressing both hands against the wound. "Don't you goddamn dare!" Her eyes fluttered. "I can walk. You can't even stand. I've had worse." "Then you're either lying or already half dead." She gritted her teeth. "There's a trail. North Ridge. 2 miles. Springs there. This." He looked at her, really looked, and knew. She wouldn't make it on her own, and neither could he. So he lifted her. She was light, almost alarmingly so. Her weight folded into him like she belonged there, one arm draped weakly around his neck, her breath warming the base of his throat. He ran. Through snow, through thorns, through fog that burned his eyes. The land tilted upward, cruel and endless. "He fell once. Got back up." Her voice rasped in his ear. "The rocks, they'll shine red when we're close, like they're bleeding. Just hold on." "Thud? Yeah? If I die, don't bury me near them. Don't say that. Promise." He gritted his teeth. "I won't bury you at all." Then light. A strange, shimmering glow between the trees. The pines thin, and there it was. A pool, no wider than a wagon wheel, nestled between blood-red rocks, steam curling off its surface like breath from a sleeping god. The spring. He stumbled the last few feet, collapsed to his knees, cradling her against him. "I'm here," he whispered. "You hear me, Luna? We made it." Her lips were blue. "Please," he begged, "don't go quiet now." With shaking hands, he lowered her into the water. The change was immediate. Her skin twitched, then shivered. Then, color returned. Her breath hitched, and her eyes opened. Not wide, not bright, but alive. She blinked, then smiled barely. "You carried me." "Of course I did. Lee." She rested her head against his chest. "I didn't think you would. Guess we both got surprises in us." He touched her face, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. Behind them, the forest stirred. A silhouette emerged from the shadows. Tall, confident, rifle at his back. "Nyack." His voice was calm, almost amused. "So this is where you ran, sister." Thad stood, placing himself between Luna and the man. "Back off." Nyack tilted his head. "You die for her?" "I'd live for her." "Lay." The words surprised even him. Nyack smirked. "Then bleed for her." He raised his rifle. Thad moved. Gunfire tore the stillness apart. Pain, sharp, blooming in Thad's side like wildfire on dry brush. He collapsed. Luna screamed, and then she was on her feet, somehow, knife flashing. Nyack turned too late. Steel met throat. He dropped. Hard. "Still," Thad gasped, clutching his ribs. Luna knelt beside him. Blood streaked across her face, her eyes wild with panic and love and something deeper. "You said you wouldn't bury me," she whispered. He smiled weakly. "Guess now you owe me the same promise." The spring steamed in the cold dawn like a breath held too long, warm mist curling into the pines, dancing over the blood-soaked snow, whispering things that the wind would never tell. Luna's hands trembled as she pressed the deerskin cloth into Thad's wound, her knees soaked and red, her face streaked with grime and fury and something she hadn't let herself feel in years, fear of losing someone. He was slipping fast. Blood seeped through her fingers like time through clenched fists, slow, warm, unforgiving. His skin, already pale, had taken on the color of bone beneath the early light. His lips barely moved now, but his eyes still searched for her, as if she was the only thing tethering him to this world. "You carried me," she whispered, her voice breaking into pieces. "Now it's my turn." She gritted her teeth, tightened the cloth, and he groaned in pain. "I know," she said. "I know, I'm sorry, but I need you to stay here, Thad. Do you hear me? Don't float off yet. This ain't your time." His lips twitched, dry. Still, bossy. A bitter laugh escaped her. She took the knife, the same one that had once tasted her brother's blood, and cut open her own palm, quick and clean. Then she reached into the spring, let her blood mix with the sacred water, and cupped it gently. The warmth pulsed against her skin, not hot, not cold, but alive, like the earth was breathing through it. "Let it remember him," she whispered. "Let it see him." She pressed the water to Thad's lips. He drank slowly, weakly. A minute passed. Then two. Then his back arched suddenly. A sharp cry tore from his chest like something ancient being exorcised. His eyes flew open wide, filled with both pain and clarity, and then they changed. Luna froze, because she saw it in them, not just life. Memory, he gasped, voice ragged. The girl, the one I couldn't save. You remember? He nodded slowly. It was you. She swallowed hard. You were younger. You reached for me through the fire and I turned away. I thought I was saving you by running, but I left you behind. Her voice trembled. You didn't know. You were wounded. I knew enough, he said. And I hated myself for forgetting your face. But now I remember every damn inch of it. Silence wrapped around them like a second skin. Luna looked away. The wind shifted. He reached for her wrist. Look at me. She did. I remember leaving you, he said. But more than that, I remember the way you looked at me like I was your only chance. And I ran. Luna's eyes burned. We've all run from something, but now we don't have to anymore. Thad nodded, chest rising and falling with effort. What happens now? We go back, she said. With proof. With you. With the spring. His brow furrowed. They won't listen. They'll listen to me. The return journey was slow, carved by exhaustion and silence. Luna refused to let him walk until he could stand without shaking. She found her strength in the rhythm of his breath and the weight of his shoulder beneath her arm. They wrapped Nyak's body in pine boughs and left it beneath a cairn of red stones. Not forgiveness, not vengeance, just a marker of what had been done. It took them 2 days to descend the mountain. By the time they reached the outer ridge of the Cherokee camp, dusk had painted the sky in bruised purples and copper reds. The guards saw them, first eyes narrowing, weapons rising, but froze when they recognized the mark on Luna's shoulder and the way Thad stood beside her. Not ahead, not behind, beside. They were led through without a word, the whispers curling behind them like smoke. Luna, still breathing? Did she bring a white man here? Is that Thad Thorne? The council sat waiting in the center lodge. 5 elders, eyes like dry riverbeds. They stared down at Luna as if she were a ghost that had clawed its way back through snow and fire. I see you still breathe, one of them said. She stepped forward. And I see you still sit. A murmur passed through the crowd. Why return, exile? She didn't flinch. To show you the truth. She tossed the bloodied pouch onto the floor. Inside, a soaked map, a torn strip of Thad's uniform, and a shard of obsidian glowing faintly with warmth from the spring. One elder lifted eyes wide. This is not legend, Luna said. This is not myth. I found the spring, and I didn't keep it. I bled for it. He bled for it. She turned, helped Thad step forward. This man, she said, voice shaking, is the reason I'm alive. He's the reason the spring lives in memory again. A long pause. Then, quietly, from the far end of the circle, he remembers. They turned. It was a woman old, blind in one eye, with hands that trembled as she lifted them. I was there, long ago, the girl screaming in the flames. I remember the white man who looked back. He carried shame on his back like a burden too heavy for war. He's carried it ever since. Another voice. Then let it end here. And another. The water does not judge. Only we do. Silence. Then at last, you may stay, Luna. She exhaled sharply, painfully, like she'd been holding that breath for years. Her knees buckled slightly, and Thad caught her. They didn't smile. Not yet. But they stood, together. That night, under a cold and watching moon, Luna sat beside Thad in a small tent on the outskirts of the camp. The fire flickered between them, small and quiet. You healed fast, she said, half teasing. He touched his ribs. The water helps, but it wasn't the only thing. She looked at him. No? He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation. You said the spring chooses. I think it chose us both. She didn't reply. She didn't have to, because she leaned into him then, head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart that had once forgotten her, and now remembered everything. The morning broke quietly. No wind, no snow, just a slow, gold light creeping across the valley floor like forgiveness. The camp stirred around them, with the soft hush of waking embers and distant footsteps. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere a woman sang. But within the canvas walls of Luna's tent, Everything stood still like time itself had decided to pause and watch them one last time. Thad lay on the woven mat, arms behind his head, eyes on the sliver of sunlight cutting through the tent flap. He had never felt peace like this before, not in the barracks, not in the mountains, not even in her arms during the quiet hours of last night. This peace came not from silence, but from something far rarer, being seen, entirely, and still chosen. Luna sat cross-legged beside him, braiding her hair with practiced grace. Her fingers moved with the same steadiness she'd used to draw maps, bind wounds, and slit the throat of the man who betrayed her. Her shoulder, once torn, was healing well now, the angry slash reduced to a red kiss against her copper skin. She didn't look at him as she spoke. "They want me to stay." He nodded slowly. "I figured. They said they need someone to watch over the spring, someone the land has forgiven. They—" He turned to her then, propping himself on one elbow. "And what do you want?" She paused, mid-braid. That pause said everything. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to rebuild what they broke. Prove I still belong here, that I never stopped being Cherokee. And the other part?" She looked at him finally, softly. "Wants to ride away and never look back." Thad sat up, his face, always a map of storms, now unreadable. "I ain't gonna ask you to choose," he said. "You already did," she replied without heat. "The minute you walked with me into that spring, you asked." He exhaled slowly. "Then I take it back. You owe me nothing, Luna." She stood then, pacing to the tent's edge, where the flap fluttered like a heartbeat. "I don't owe you," she said, "but I miss you when you're not touching me." He blinked. "I don't understand how I can trust someone who once left me burning," she whispered. "But when you sleep beside me, I believe the fire won't touch me again." He rose, walked to her, stood inches from her back. "You don't have to trust the past," he said. "Just trust what we are now." Later that morning, they stood before the tribal council once more. The elders offered Luna the role of keeper of the spring, a title sacred, binding, respected. Thad stood beside her, quiet, shoulders squared. He hadn't spoken much that day. He didn't need to. Everything worth saying had been said in the way he cleaned his rifle without hurry, in the way his eyes searched for her across the fire, in the way his fingers brushed hers like a question left unanswered. The council waited, and Luna looked to the mountains. "This spring," she said at last, voice steady, "has waited centuries to be seen again. It deserves a guardian, someone who understands its silence. But I'm not the only one it chose." They frowned. She turned, took Thad's hand. "I won't stay behind just to be honored. I won't carry another title that feels like a cage." Thad swallowed hard. She smiled. "I've walked through fire. I've walked through ice. But it was him who carried me when my legs gave out, and I want to carry that kind of love with me." Gasps echoed through the crowd. One elder stepped forward. "You would turn your back on us again?" Luna didn't blink. "I'm not walking away. I'm walking forward. There's a difference." "Oof." The old woman who had once remembered Thad spoke next. "Then go," she said, "but let the spring remember you." They left at sundown. No one stopped them. Some turned away, others watched. And a few, the youngest, the ones who still believed in stories whispered at night, bowed their heads with quiet reverence. Luna rode her old bay mare, head high, hair loose. Thad rode beside her, wearing a fresh bandage beneath his coat, but a freer smile than he'd worn in years. Behind them, the mountains swallowed the last of the village. Before them, the world open. They rode for 3 days, crossing through frost-tipped meadows and narrow canyons painted gold by dying leaves. They stopped at hot springs tucked between volcanic rock, cooked rabbit over cedar smoke, and slept wrapped in thick wool and each other. They didn't talk about the future, not with words, but in the way they held hands when thunder rolled across distant ridges, in the way she leaned her head on his chest when owls called, in the way he whispered her Naminot like a question, but like a promise. On the 4th morning, they found a clearing near a river bend. Wildflowers still bloomed, even this late in the season. Luna dismounted first, eyes scanning the horizon. "Here," she said, "this feels right." Thad nodded. "You want to build here?" "No," she said. "I want to begin here." Letward. They worked side by side, clearing brush, stacking stones, mapping where the sun would rise each season. Their home wouldn't be big, but it would be theirs. And it would be enough. One night, weeks later, with the fire crackling low and snow beginning to whisper against the canvas roof of their tent, Luna curled into Thad's side and whispered something soft. "I used to dream of revenge." He brushed her cheek with a thumb. "And now? Now I dream of tomatoes, chickens, a porch swing." He laughed, the sound deep, surprised. "I can build that," he said. She smiled into his chest. "I know." They never forgot the spring. But they didn't need to return to it, because they had found something rarer than healing water. They had found each other, bruised and rebuilt, stronger at the broken parts. There are places the maps never touch, corners of earth not measured by miles or borders, but by the weight of silence and the warmth of a shared glance across a wooden table. That's where they built it. Their home sat low by the river bend, where the water slowed enough to reflect the sky broad, ever-changing, always deeper than it first seemed. It wasn't much. 2 rooms framed by pine logs, a stone hearth built by Thad's hands, and a porch just wide enough for the swing Luna had dreamed of. The floor creaked in the corners. The roof leaked when the spring storms rolled through. But it held the sound of laughter and coffee and boots drying by the door. And it held them. In the year that followed their leaving, the world didn't grow kinder. The mountains still claimed travelers. The cold still came early, and men still whispered about gold, blood, and power. But Thad and Luna carved out something stubborn and rare, a life, not shaped by fear or duty, but by choice. Each day, they planted tomatoes, beans, maize brought from a trader passing south. Luna coaxed them from the earth with patient hands, singing low songs in a tongue Thad didn't understand, but learned to hum along with. He built the chicken pen from scrap wood and old nails, swearing every time the rooster escaped, but laughing harder when Luna caught it faster than he could blink. The land gave back slowly, but it did give back. One evening, as autumn leaned heavy into the trees, painting them gold and rust, Luna stood barefoot by the river with her hands resting on her belly. The air was cool. The scent of cedar smoke drifted behind her from the chimney. Her braid fell loose over one shoulder, and her profile against the light made her look carved from the dusk itself, ancient, unshakable. Thad came up behind her quietly, his steps worn into the soil from 100 days just like this. "Been staring at the water a while," he said. "It's moving slower," she murmured. "Winter's coming." She nodded, then turned, and her hand found his. "I'm late," she said simply. Thad blinked, then breathed, then pulled her to him, not like a hero claiming a prize but like a man anchoring himself to the only thing in the world that made him want to be gentle again. They said nothing more that night, but everything had changed. The weeks passed in rhythms that no longer needed clocks. Chop wood, feed chickens, sew, hammer, rest, laugh, kiss, sleep. And sometimes, in the quiet, Luna would speak of the spring, not the water itself, but the memory of it, of how it shimmered beneath the frost, waiting for the right soul to believe in it, of how the tribe had sent messenger letters tied with rabbit hide and ink pressed from juniper berries. They wanted her to return, to bring the child into the tribe, to name the baby in the old way. Luna didn't reply to the first letter, but by the third, she folded the parchment slowly and set it beside the hearth. Then she turned to Thad, who was polishing the blade she'd once used to end Nyack. "I don't want to go back," she said. He didn't ask why. She answered anyway. "I'm not angry anymore, but I'm not theirs either." When the child came, it was a long night, hard and raw. Thad never left her side. Not when the storm began outside, not when the midwife, an old woman from the southern Pueblo, whispered words in 2 languages, not even when Luna screamed, teeth clenched, muscles tight as bowstrings. At dawn, the wind stilled, and a girl was born, dark-haired, wide-eyed, quiet as a breath. They named her a Luna, name twisted gently from the river, and the stars and the roots of 2 names wrapped into one. She was small, but fierce, like her mother. And when Thad held her for the first time, the weight of her tiny chest against his own broke something open in him that war, memory, and guilt had never touched. "Hey there, little thing," he whispered. "You're real, huh?" She blinked, and he wept. Years passed like wind carving stone, slow, steady, unrelenting. Luna grew barefoot and wild, chasing foxes and fireflies with a knife too big for her belt and stories too big for her heart. She asked questions